without further ado, I'll introduce our chairman, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good to have you here. In this historic first meeting of the Presidential Commission on Religious Liberty, the meeting comes to order, and I would ask Bishop Barron to lead us in prayer to start. Bishop? Have it out.
Testing. There. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, King of the universe, Lord Most High, we give you thanks and praise for all your gifts to us. On this day, as our Commission on Religious Liberty commences its work, we thank you, Lord, for our country, which is based upon the acknowledgement that our freedoms and rights come from you. We ask you to guide our efforts, to grant us the wisdom, the prudence, the courage, and the charity that we need to accomplish our goal, which is the enhancement of our first freedom, the liberty to worship you in accord with the dictates of conscience. We ask you to forgive our sins and to remove those prejudices and attachments that would prevent us from giving honor and glory to you in all things. We make all these prayers in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
To those of you watching online, welcome, and to those in the live audience, we appreciate you traveling here. A little background on how did we get here. On November 19th of last year, after the election, President Trump and I had a conversation. And in the conversation, we talked about establishing a presidential commission on religious liberty, that the time was right in this country to do so. On that first day, within a very few minutes, we said we wanted a committee of about 12 or 13. We have 13. We have a few who are traveling today. Cardinal Dolan sends his regrets. His train was canceled, so he's hoping to catch the second one out of New York. And Franklin Graham, Reverend Graham, and Eric Metaxas are in Europe. Their schedules were already committed in advance. But we have a committee, an outstanding committee, as you will meet and hear today. And then we said, who do we want on that committee? We want faith leaders. We want scholars. We want historians. We want people who have been to the Supreme Court and been involved in a number of cases on religious liberty. Once the president was sworn in and his staff was in place and the cabinet members were confirmed, we started in earnest working on this commission in March. It took several weeks to write the executive order, and on May 1st, the National Day of Prayer, we were in the Rose Garden, many of us, and the commission was officially announced with the executive order and the members of the commission. We also have advisory boards that are made up of scholars, historians, clergy that will advise us along the way, and some of those are here with us today. I want to thank Susie Wiles, the Chief of Staff to the President, who set up the Faith Office, of which Paula White, who is with us, is the Senior Advisor to the President. And I want to thank Vince Haley, the domestic, he's in charge of domestic policy, who has been instrumental in establishing this with Paula and the Faith Office. I want to thank Brittany Baldwin and Mary Margaret Bush, who created this set for us today. I want to thank the Museum of the Bible for allowing us to hold this hearing here. And we're going to have someone from the museum speak a little later in the afternoon about a fascinating story of the Bible in America. And most importantly, I want to thank the President for entrusting all of us, inviting all of us to serve, and for me to chair this great commission. Our plan is to have 7 to 9 hearings. The next hearing will be in September, and you'll get notice on that in October, November, then in February, March, and April. And our charter clearly says we have 2 roles. That is to advise and report to the President. A presidential commission does not report to Congress, but the findings from our committees will be reported to the President to see what action would happen after that. So with that, I'm honored to introduce our Vice Chair, Dr. Ben Carson, my longtime friend, and we're going to go around and have every member give opening remarks, and I'll introduce each of you after Dr. Carson. Dr. Carson.
Human beings are more than flesh and blood. We have a spiritual component that is recognized by all religions. If we had only evolved from a slime pit filled with promiscuous biochemicals, there would be no mechanism or reason for a spiritual component, and we would be like all other animals. That distinction is a privilege and has led to many different belief systems, virtually all of which influence behavioral norms. Those behavioral norms help establish a moral code, which in turn promotes civilization. Imagine trying to live in a society with no moral code. This commission promotes freedom of beliefs and that spiritual aspect of our existence that advances civilization. We will strive to facilitate the maintenance of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Next is Bishop Barron. He's an author, speaker, theologian. Bishop Robert Barron reaches millions of people around the world on his Word on Fire ministry. Since 2023, Bishop Barron has served as the bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester, and Minnesota. Bishop?
Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a privilege to serve on this commission. As I do so, I'm standing in the tradition of Father Hesburgh of Notre Dame, who I understand was on 16 separate presidential commissions back in the 20th century. So I think it's an important role that a church person can play in this lively public conversation, and especially around this issue of religious liberty, which has been very important for the U.S. bishops for the past many decades. I've served on our committee on religious liberty for the past about 5 years. So we've taken it very seriously. My own conviction is that we've got a very special battle today. There's a texture to the way religion is being attacked in our society. It's coming from a Rennian philosophy that Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, called the dictatorship of relativism. I'd call it the culture of self-invention, the complete prioritization given to individual autonomy, that we decide value, we decide meaning, we decide purpose. And I think that philosophy, which is becoming, as I say, increasingly influential in our society, rightly appreciates the classical religions as the chief opponent, because we stand for objective moral values, we stand for God as the ground of those values, we stand for a sense of a stable human nature. And I think the rival philosophy rightly sees that as the opponent. And so I've been watching it for the past many years. I was bishop out in California for 6 years. An attempt to get religion out of public life, to get religion out of healthcare, to get it out of education. So I think that's the battle that we're in. And it's a battle, now put it in very American terms, for religious liberty, our first freedom. And so both as an American and as a Catholic bishop, I'm delighted to be part of that struggle, that conversation. So that's why I'm happy to be on this commission.
Thank you, Bishop. Carrie Bowler, former Miss California USA and Miss USA first runner-up in 2009. Carrie is the author of Still Standing, Still Standing, The Untold Story of My Fight Against Gossip, Hate, and Political Attacks. Carrie.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, members of the Commission. I come before you not just to speak about a constitutional right, but about a sacred trust, religious liberty, rooted in the very soul of our nation. From the beginning, Christian faith shaped our understanding of freedom, law, and human dignity. The Declaration of Independence affirms that our rights come from our Creator, not from government, but from God Himself. George Washington, in his farewell address, spoke plainly. All of the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion, and morality are indispensable supports. He urged us not to suppose that morality could be maintained without religion. John Adams warned that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And John Jay, our first Chief Justice, reminded us, Providence has given our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty to prefer Christians for their rulers. These weren't abstract ideals. They were lived convictions. For nearly 200 years, school children across this country learned to read from the New England Primer, a Christian textbook, which taught them not just the alphabet, but the Word of God, moral lessons, and prayers. This was not indoctrination, it was formation. It was understood that a free people must be a virtuous people, and virtue begins with truth. Since prayer and the Bible were removed from our schools, morality has dropped across America. Today, as our culture questions the very foundation we were built on, we must ask, do we want to leave our children and grandchildren a nation our founders did not create? Because protecting religious freedom isn't just about securing a right. It is about guarding the spiritual legacy that has held this country together since its birth. We have a moral and religious duty to ensure religious freedom in America. And with that duty comes hope for America, for our future, and for the enduring strength of religious liberty. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Dr. Ryan Anderson is the president of Ethics and Public Policy Center. He is also the author or co-author of 5 books, including several related to religious liberty. Dr. Anderson?
Great. Thank you. And it's a real honor and privilege to get to serve on this commission, and I'm grateful to President Trump for the appointment. I just wanted to highlight 4 things that I hope we as a commission will be able to explore during the coming year. First are the philosophical and theological roots of religious liberty. I think it's important to understand that religious liberty matters because religion matters, because we are creatures and we owe obligations to the Creator. This is how James Madison put it in his Memorial and Remonstrance, that there's a duty that we as creatures owe to the Creator, and that's what then creates the rights amongst men, which governments are then instituted to protect. Second, I think it'll be important for us to defend a robust scope of religious liberty. Too many voices recently have reduced it merely to the freedom of worship, or you see it in mainstream media referred to so-called religious liberty, or religious liberty in scare quotes. Other voices want to say religious liberty is only for people of my particular confession, whatever that confession happens to be. And then I just think the startling rise, the resurgence of anti-Semitism that we have seen, particularly on college campuses, particularly on elite college campuses. I think George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island is so important. It's no longer that toleration is spoken of, right? He's digging at John Locke right there. The Jewish people get to exercise their inherent natural rights. The U.S. government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. So a robust scope for religious liberty. Third, that we explore the new threats to religious liberty. I think what we're seeing right now, the primary threats to religious liberty are unjust laws in the first place. And so exemptions from unjust laws won't be a sufficient remedy, but we actually need to think through what just laws would look like. And then lastly, and Carrie just touched on this, the importance of religious liberty in the public square. This isn't merely the right to worship in the privacy of your chapel or your home, but to bring your religious values into the public square for discussions of public justice and the common good. I think the attempts to create what my old boss referred to as the naked public square by some secularist voices has been a disaster. It, in essence, is denying robust religious liberty to people of faith to exercise their religious liberty in the public square. So I hope we can touch on all 4 of those things in the coming year. And again, it's a real honor to be able to serve the country in this way.
Thank you, Doctor. Kelly Shackelford, my longtime friend back in Texas, is President and Chief Executive Officer of First Liberty Institute. He's a constitutional scholar who has argued before the Supreme Court a number of times on religious liberty issues. Kelly?
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, by God's grace, we live in the greatest country on the face of the earth. And the reason for that is how we were created, by people fleeing other countries, coming to this country for freedom. And not just freedom, religious freedom. Quakers, Baptists, Anabaptists, Congregationalists, and so on and so on. I mean, they wanted a country where they could live with the fullest free exercise of religion possible, where the government didn't interfere between them and their relationship with God. And that makes this country really unique. It's why that we actually believe as a country that our freedoms, our rights come from God, and no government can take those away. You don't see that around the world. And sometimes people ask, they say, well, I'm not religious, so should I care about this? And the answer is absolutely. Our founders called this our first freedom because they understood if you lose this freedom, you will lose all of your freedoms. And the best way I can describe why that's true is the one thing that a totalitarian regime will never allow are citizens who hold an allegiance to one higher than the government. So whenever that type of power of coalescing comes together, the first flashpoint is always going to be religious freedom. And if you lose there, you will lose everything else. So we are really dealing with here the precipice of all of our freedoms. And so what an honor that we get to do this on behalf of the American people. And it's already been mentioned by the chair, our specific responsibility is to deliver advice and specific recommendations to the president on how to secure and advance religious freedom for all Americans. And I just think it's an honor to work together with all of you and for the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Our next guest needs little introduction. Dr. Phil, best-selling author and, of course, host of a decades-running long television show, often #1 in the ratings everywhere it airs. His most recent book, We've Got Issues, How You Can Stand Strong for America's Soul and Sanity, encourages Americans to reclaim the principles of hard work, independence, and faith. Dr. Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. God save these United States and this honorable court. In God we trust on all of our currency. These are words that our founding fathers used and have for the pendency of this country. The American experiment was built on many bold ideas, none more radical than this. We have inalienable rights that come from God. Our founders foresaw that a power-hungry federal government might try to take those God-given rights from us, so they wrote protections against that into our founding documents. Chief among those were protections of religious liberty. Just for, as Kelly said, that's the underpinning to everything else. Our founders didn't view religion as a threat to liberty. They saw it as liberty's guardian. They didn't create a secular state. They created a free one where faith could flourish and shape public life. They were right to be concerned because today religious liberty is under assault. Now, I've been a mental health professional for 50 years, and it is clear to me that the family unit is the backbone of any society, none more than American society, and that liberty to freely practice a religion of choice is critical because it is the glue that can hold that family together. And I further believe that family is under attack now more than ever. We are in a cultural war, and not one among us can afford to be a non-combatant as we fight for the soul and sanity of these United States. We have to all pay attention to this, because if this one goes, if the ideologues are able to pull the rug out from under religious liberty, everything else comes tumbling down. And I am really proud that we are here and have the opportunity to talk about this and protect this liberty. And this isn't non-denominational, it's multi-denominational. It is for everybody, every belief. And I just want to thank Chairman Patrick, Vice Chairman Carson, thank you, and of course, above all, President Trump for creating this commission. I hope we all rise to the occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. Pastor Paula White is the founder and president of Paula White Ministries and the National Faith Advisory Board. She is the teaching pastor at Story Life Church in Orlando, Florida. Pastor White was an advisor to President Trump in the Faith and Opportunity Initiative during his first term and now serves as the senior advisor to the White House Office of Faith, which is the first faith office ever established by any president in the history of the country, just steps away from the Oval Office. Paula?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. So good to be with everyone this morning, and I am so grateful today to be a member of this Religious Liberty Commission with such brilliant minds, with servant leadership, and with righteous hearts. It's truly an honor. And to serve as senior advisor to President Trump over the White House, I would say newly created and historic, as Chairman said, White House Faith Office, is truly a joy and a pleasure. And thanks to the leadership of President Trump, there is a White House Faith Office that is solely dedicated to people of all faith. With religious liberty as our bedrock, it is our top priority. It is what we work on the most. Jenny Korn is here in the audience, and she is our faith director, along with a part of the advisory board of this religious commission. But not only Jenny, I think right now we have 6 in the executive office of the president, and we have faith directors in every agency and every department. As Chairman said, President elevated this to the highest point. He wanted to make sure that it was not just window dressing to be in the West Wing, but that it was priority to him, and that he wanted to make it such an important part to people in America. Religious liberty is the bedrock of the founding of our country. It allows freedom to practice our faith, and every one of us have that right, as heard so many times by all of the members here, to approach God and to worship Him freely. And that's what's made our country flourish from the very beginning. President Trump has tasked the White House Faith Office with ensuring that religious liberty is protected for future generations. But we see that in recent years, some federal, some state, many people have, Kelly, my friend here, has fought so many times in the Supreme Court and fought for people who were violated for this. Local policies have threatened America's beautiful tradition of religious liberty, and that should not be so. Houses of worship have been attacked, have been shut down, employees have been fired over their faith, religious liberties or religious entities have been debanked, parental rights have been violated. Who would have ever thought that in the very beginning, President Trump would have to pardon 23 pro-lifers for standing outside of an abortion clinic and praying silently? Or that the FBI would spy on our traditional Catholic Church? Or that a coach who would kneel on the side of a football field would have to fight all the way up to the Supreme Court to silently pray? I'm 59 years old, and that's not the America that I grew up in. We have a lot of work to do, and I believe that this task force will do it, or this commission will do it. As President Trump has said in his speeches and presidential documents, he is committed to vigorously enforce all federal laws protecting religious liberty. He'll defend that fundamental freedom with absolute devotion, and this commission will play a crucial role in helping the president fulfill these commitments. While the president and the White House Faith Office are working quickly to eradicate immediate threats to religious liberty, the commission will focus on long-term strategies to secure religious freedom for future generations. We will gather data, conduct legal analysis, hold public hearings to capture the stories of everyday Americans related to religious liberty. And this work will ensure that the administration has the best researched, most comprehensive understanding of the current state of America's religious liberty in our nation's history. The hearings held, research conducted, and data gathered by this commission will be invaluable to President Trump, and it's so vitally important to him and to the White House Faith Office to develop and execute a long-term strategy to protect religious freedoms for all Americans of all faiths for all times. And in conclusion, we must protect and defend our freedom to practice religion with every single fiber of our being, to keep people and the country strong without fear of government discrimination. All people of faith have the right to have their voice in government. 40 years in ministry now, I've been all over the world to almost 140 countries, and my greatest fight has been for religious liberty. It's an honor, Chairman.
Thank you, Pastor. Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. Rabbi?
Thank you, Chairman Patrick, for your leadership. Thank you to Vice Chair Carson and to my distinguished colleagues on this commission. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to the President of the United States for charging us with this important task. In 1788, a parade was held in Philadelphia to celebrate Pennsylvania's ratification of the Constitution. It was attended by Benjamin Rush, founding father, famous physician, devout Christian, signer of the Declaration of Independence. Rush recorded an aspect of the procession that impressed him above all, which was the participation of the city's clergy, which included 3 individuals walking together, what Rush described as, quote, the rabbi of the Jews locked in the arms of 2 ministers of the gospel. Rush reflected that this was, quote, a most delightful sight. There could not have been a more happy emblem contrived of that section of the new Constitution which opens its powers and offices alike, not only to every sect of Christians, but worthy men of every religion. So Rush wrote. And this eventually captured, I think, the uniquely American understanding of religious freedom, which is that it does not seek a secular civic space. It welcomes faith into society in all of its multifaceted forms, never asking of Americans that if we seek to be part of the polity, we check our observances at the door. For to do so would be to amputate the most essential part of ourselves. We bring our faith with us into society, for it is faith that fuels and inspires and guides our engagement with the civic realm. This, of course, as my friend Dr. Anderson mentioned, is the essential difference between so-called freedom of worship, which implies that religion is reserved for the sanctuary, and the genuinely American form of religious liberty that we know as free exercise. Yet over the years, this important distinction and the founders' approach to faith and freedom has been lost or ignored or elided or deliberately denied within the academy, in many state legislatures, and, for some period of time, the same could be said consequentially for the courts. Recently, the Supreme Court has paved a path to a more accurate and original understanding of the American conception of liberty, as well as the role of faith in the fabric of our society. But there remains so much work still to be done. Benjamin Rush tells us that at the parade, quote, the clergy formed a very agreeable part of the procession. They manifested, he wrote, by their attendance, their sense of the connection between religion and good government. It is rediscovering this connection that is the calling of our commission, and I feel profoundly privileged to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Allison Ho is partner of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Allison Ho has established herself as one of the United States' premier appellate lawyers. She has presented over 100 oral arguments in federal and state courts nationwide, including 5 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Allison?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm profoundly grateful to President Trump for establishing this important commission and deeply humbled to serve on it. The First Amendment is often called the first freedom because it's the foundation of individual liberty in our great nation. Courage is often called the first virtue because it's the one that guarantees all the rest. As an attorney, I've been blessed to advocate for everyday Americans who exemplify the first virtue, courage, by fighting for the first freedom, religious liberty, often at great cost to themselves, their families, and their livelihoods. But too often, the courage of these individuals is woefully lacking in the judges who decide their cases. Some judges hide behind procedural rules and judge-made doctrines to avoid deciding these cases at all. In one case about a veteran's memorial in the shape of a cross, a judge suggested that the defenders of the memorial should appease those it offended by, quote, chopping the arms off the memorial cross. That's not the Babylon Bee, that's an Article 3 judge. I pray this commission will serve with the courage of the everyday Americans who fight for our first freedom, of our president, who has made the first freedom a cornerstone of his administration, and of our founders, who established a priceless legacy of religious freedom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Allison. As chair of this committee, when we were in the Rose Garden with the president, I couldn't help but think of where I grew up, 48 miles north of the Rose Garden in the inner city Baltimore, in a 12-foot wide home with marble steps. And how did I get to the Rose Garden? As a kid, I never thought I'd even meet a president or ever visit the White House. And how was I selected for this? Only in America and only through God. We have one of the most robust religious communities of faith anywhere in the world. Our religious faith in this country lifts up people. It funds hospitals, food pantries. It helps the homeless, those addicted to alcohol and drugs. A community of faith is a great thing, not a good thing. And our founders knew that. We should take stock of why did that happen in this country? Why in this country and no other place in the world? We are the leaders in our charitable giving to countries all around the world. We are the first ones there. It wasn't an accident. It was by design. Our founders based a government built on the Bible that protects the individual and their freedoms and their liberty to worship God as they choose, or not at all if they choose, but individual rights. And they wrote the First Amendment to protect our inalienable rights and of free expression. But they were wise enough not to have a government that dictated or established a religion. That was their wisdom, but rather let it be to each individual on their own conscience and their own beliefs of how they should worship and how they should pray. Then they guaranteed this magnificent inheritance of religious liberty to us all. And this commission, in part with the president's guiding, is so that we all in America can reclaim that inheritance that our founders gave us. The Declaration of Independence is consistent with the Bible, and the Bible is consistent with the Declaration of Independence, but many Americans are rightly confused. They don't know, because of decades of court cases that often were in direct opposition to what our founders believed and said, have taken away their religious liberty. Where can I pray? When can I pray? Who can I pray to? Because this commission is about all faiths. Can I wear a religious symbol to work, and will the boss tell me to take it off? And is that his right or my right? Will the HOA tell me I can't display a symbol based on my faith on my own property? The commission will answer those questions and many more questions over the next year. We want to let America know you have a great inheritance of religious liberty. And this commission over this time will free you to be free to pray where and when you want. The book of Jude is one of the smallest books in the Bible. It's only 600 words. It's next to Revelations at the end. And it's different from the other books because the other Gospels were, for the most part, for non-believers. But Jude spoke to the believers. And there's a line in there that I love. He says we must contend earnestly. In modern day parlance, that would be we must fight for our right. This commission, on behalf of the President and the people of this country, and God Almighty, will contend earnestly for religious liberty. A little bit later, we will have a guest from our Attorney General. It will be the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. We serve under the Department of Justice, so we are honored that she will join us. As you can imagine, she has a very busy schedule, and she will join us sometime a little bit later this morning or early afternoon. With that, I want to call our first two witnesses. Mark Rienzi and Professor Gerald Bradley, would you step up to the witness table? Mark Rienzi is CEO and president of Beckett, a nonprofit public interest law firm dedicated to defending the religious freedom of people of all faiths. Mr. Rienzi has successfully argued a number of First Amendment cases before the Supreme Court. He is a professor at Catholic University of America Columbus School of Law. Professor Gerald Bradley is a renowned legal scholar and professor emeritus at the University of Notre Dame Law School. As director of the Natural Law Institute and co-editor of the American Journal of Jurisprudence, Professor Bradley has published over 100 scholarly articles on constitutional law, legal ethics, and legal philosophy. The way the hearing will proceed is each witness has 10 minutes, and they have a clock in front of them, and they'll get a 2-minute warning if they need 2 more minutes. They'll both speak, and then after that, we will open up for questions from our committee members. So, Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There you go.
That's on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. It is an honor to speak with you this morning about religious liberty. Our American commitment to religious liberty is essential for 4 reasons. First, religion is part of our human nature. History teaches that humans seek God. We look for something greater than ourselves. We naturally ask questions that governments can't answer and shouldn't try to answer. Second, religious liberty is woven into our founding. Many who came to these shores were religious refugees, people fleeing persecution, trying to live out their faith. Their pursuit of religious freedom helped create America. Third, religious freedom is a powerful force for peace and pluralism. A nation that respects conscience, even when we disagree, is better equipped to handle difference without division. Religious liberty thus makes us stronger and more unified. Fourth, religious liberty is both the basis and the bellwether for all other human rights. It is often the first right to be attacked, and when it falls, others inevitably follow. But the opposite is also true and cause for great hope, and that is that where religious liberty is protected, other rights flourish. Religious liberty is thus foundational. It protects the broader architecture of liberty and human dignity for everyone, religious or not. And that is precisely why this commission's work matters so much. You all have the rare opportunity to stand for a right that transcends political divides, that benefits everyone, and that reflects the very best of the American experiment. At the founding, just like today, this was a nation of people with deeply held and deeply divergent opinions. In Europe, people were killing each other over these disagreements, using the power of government to crush disfavored ideas and disfavored people. But the genius of the American approach is that we took those disagreements and we harnessed them to create a system of freedom and pluralism by which we all benefit. Religious liberty is the centerpiece of that system. Most people throughout history have lived under regimes that stifle differing opinions on big questions like religion. But that is not the American way. Our founders recognized that we have rights not as a gift from government, but from the God who created us in his own image. And at the top of that list, with only rare limitations, is the freedom to live out one's faith. That commitment to human rights and religious liberty makes the United States a beacon of hope and freedom for the entire world. Of course, our pursuit of those ideals has been imperfect. At various times, we have discriminated against virtually every group of religious people. It is crucial that we learn from those mistakes. 2 contrasting Supreme Court cases help illustrate how important it is to get religious liberty right, and how dangerous it is to get it wrong. The first is one they don't teach much in law schools these days anymore, but they should. Minersville School District versus Gobitis. The case illustrates what I would call the government control approach to religious liberty. The Gobitis case actually has its roots in Nazi Germany. As Hitler's Nazi Party was gaining power, they crashed into a small religious group that had come from America called the Jehovah's Witnesses. In Germany, the Witnesses refused to do the Heil Hitler salute to the Nazi flag. They thought it was the equivalent of worshiping a false idol. Not surprisingly, the Nazi government was not pleased. They threw many witnesses into concentration camps. They took their children away, sent them off to German schools to make them good nationalist Germans. The Nazis had government control, they knew how to use it, and they did not brook dissent. Back here in America, the Jehovah's Witnesses heard about all this, and though they didn't think our government was anything like the Nazis, they eventually decided that they shouldn't salute the flag either. And when two young school children, Lillian and Billy Gobaitis, told their teacher that they couldn't salute the flag because of their religion, the Supreme Court got its first flag salute case. Sadly and wrongly, the court said that the government gets to control, even in matters of conscience. The court said that religious liberty was important, but then it said that legislatures and even school boards get to choose and have the power to decide when to coerce violations of faith. The court's ruling set off a wave of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses. They were physically beaten. They were dragged out of their houses, dragged into the streets and forced to salute the flag. Their houses of worship were burned to the ground. They were shot at. One sheriff explained why he wouldn't intervene to help them. Quote, "They're traitors. The Supreme Court says so." Thankfully, just 3 years later, the Supreme Court reversed itself in West Virginia versus Barnett. While Gobaitis had embraced government control over everything, including your relationship with God, Barnett rejects that stingy view of liberty. Here's the famous quote: "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein." In short, the court said that some things are beyond the reach of politics and government. The Bill of Rights must be respected and protected at every level of government and for every person. As you all frame the work you will do on this commission, I urge you to embrace the principled Barnett approach to liberty. That is not always easy. Governments often think some other value ought to rank higher than respecting religious freedom, especially for someone with unpopular religious beliefs. Please do not accept the sacrifice of religious liberty for political convenience. Don't accept the government control approach of Gobaitis. That is a cheap counterfeit of liberty, and you all were not called to this commission to serve a cheap counterfeit of liberty. America's overall story of religious liberty is quite positive. But since you asked for recommendations, let me give you 3 recent examples of places where our society has fallen short. After the October 7th terrorist attacks in Israel, many American college campuses succumbed to horrific anti-Semitism. Jewish students were harassed, swastikas became common. At UCLA, there was a Jew exclusion zone in the heart of the campus. Shockingly, UCLA used its police force to turn Jewish students away rather than helping them through. In another case, courts recently turned their backs on the Western Apache people, refusing to protect a sacred site where they have practiced their faith for generations. Now that holy ground is in danger of being destroyed so that a foreign-owned company can extract copper from it. And you are likely familiar with the plight of the Little Sisters of the Poor, Catholic sisters who provide loving homes for the elderly. State and federal governments have been trying for more than a decade to force the sisters to help distribute contraceptives and abortion-inducing drugs. Even after 3 wins at the Supreme Court, the Little Sisters are still fighting hostile state governments in court today. The greatest and freest nation on the face of the earth can do better than fostering anti-Semitism, destroying sacred sites, or pretending we need to force nuns to give out birth control. Governments and bureaucrats will always come up with some reason they don't need to respect religion. This commission should make clear that conscience is sacred, and you should call our great and diverse nation to work with our religious differences rather than stamping them out. Remember the example of George Washington. Even when our nation's very existence stood in the balance, he respected the religious conscience of Quakers who could not bear arms. This commission should call us all to live up to that legacy. Let me make one closing point about why protecting religious liberty is so important. The entire edifice of rights in America is based on the understanding that God created humans free and equal, and that our God-endowed inalienable rights come from that intrinsic human dignity which every person shares. We see this argument in foundational American documents like the Declaration of Independence. It was also the basis for the Quakers' early petitions against slavery, petitions they were only around to make because of our early commitment to religious liberty. The late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of the UK put it this way when receiving the Canterbury Medal for Religious Freedom, quote, "In America, the tree of liberty has religious roots. Don't think you can sever those roots and have the tree of liberty survive." Religion and religious liberty give us a foundational commitment of equal respect and human dignity for everyone, including the people with whom we disagree. If religion and religious liberty are wiped away, there is no reason to expect that people will operate from that same foundation of equal respect for the human dignity of all, especially when we disagree. We don't want to live in that nasty world, and we don't want to leave it to our children and grandchildren either. The great American commitment to liberty means there are places in our lives where the government is not allowed to go. There are rights that the government is not allowed to take away. No other country in human history has protected human rights the way America has, and no other right is more essential to the perpetuation of that system than religious freedom for all. That is the legacy of liberty to which all Americans are heirs. That is the legacy of liberty that all human beings deserve. May God bless the work of this commission to advance and strengthen that legacy for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We will hold questions until our second witness, Gerald Bradley. Gerald?
Thank you, Governor Patrick and members of the Commission. America's founders were pioneers of religious liberty. Unlike practically all societies before theirs, they rejected top-down control of the people's religion through princely imposition or by the union of altar and throne or by enforcement of some eclectic civil religion, or by all three, as in England circa 1776. But the idea here in these societies was political prosperity through religious unity. Now, unlike most free societies after theirs, our founders did not secure religious liberty by erecting what Ryan Anderson's old boss, Richard Newhouse, dubbed the naked public square, a secularized space from which religion is banished. The idea here is political prosperity without religion. This idea was the Supreme Court's mid-20th century point of departure, starting in earnest with the school prayer case in 1962. The founders rejected these false alternatives. For them, it was not either public religion without freedom or freedom without public religion. The founders went all in on both and. They steadily maintained, in the words of the first Congress, which wrote the religion clauses into the Bill of Rights, that religion was necessary to both the happiness of mankind and to good government. America's founders launched an epochal, novel experiment in human rights and civil liberty, an experiment which by world historical standards has been a singular success. Now, what emboldened our founders to blaze the path of religious freedom? They were political savants, to be sure, but they knew their history, too. They knew that the politically savvy move was to control religion from the top down. So again, where did their extraordinary political courage come from? Well, their trust in divine providence is surely one reason. But providence is fully compatible with human persons' free cooperation in God's plan. Indeed, providence presupposes that freedom. God helps those who help themselves. The founders chose freely and without precedent the epochal, uncharted path of freedom with eyes wide open. But why did they do that? Because they were convinced that government's obligation to preserve and protect religious liberty is a true principle of justice and political morality. Freedom of religion for all is the only valid conclusion they could draw from a series of truths they held most firmly, though I think not, as a matter of fact, self-evidently, but call the nest of these truths, these propositions, the moral foundations of religious liberty. Now, where shall we look for a compact expression of them, those moral foundations? Well, we could look to the founding generation's preeminent guide to constitutional meaning, to the guiding force behind our First Amendment, and to the author of what the Supreme Court, or what Supreme Court justices, liberal and conservative, have all treated as the Magna Carta of American religious liberty. I speak not of three men here, but of one, James Madison. And I speak of his 1785 pamphlet against the Virginia tax for the support of ministers, the pamphlet called The Memorial and Remonstrance. And indeed, I'll just talk about the very first paragraph of it. Madison wrote that religious liberty is not about the sovereignty of the human person, what we might call subjective right. Much less was religious liberty about that idiosyncratic creativity expressed by the Supreme Court in 1992 in its infamous or famous mystery passage. For Madison and the founders, there was a sovereign in the picture, an omniscient and good one. Madison wrote, "Before any man can be considered a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe." Now, this subject was not for Madison or the other founders a law unto himself. Religious liberty as an inalienable right, or was an inalienable right according to Madison, because, Madison wrote, what is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. This obligation is not like other important moral duties, which one fulfills by inaction. Thou shalt not. This duty to the Creator is a much heavier lift, and it's inalienable for a second reason, Madison wrote, because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. This freedom of conscience, conscientious belief, is not a license for indifferentism. It is an overriding call, moral call, to knuckle down and get serious, to do some very hard thinking about divine realities. Now, central to religion is one conscientiously judging what is the case about ultimate matters, and then acting according to what one judges to be the case. Now, this obviously can only happen if people are free of coercion and manipulation. Madison wrote, "It's the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage, and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This is a duty that can only be fulfilled by free thought, judgment, decision, and subsequent action of each person. No one can perform it for you. If you don't do it, it don't get done. Now, note well, these moral foundations were not held by the founders as truths of religion. That was about what the denominations and the sects taught, revealed doctrines, the deliverances of prophets and sacred texts, ceremonies and charisms, and church precepts. The moral foundations of religious liberty, as we find them in Madison and across the founding, comprises truths about religion, about divine realities, human intelligence and free choice, and the political common good. These the founders thought to be truths to be accessible to unaided human reason. They're really more truths of political theory or actually of philosophy, not religion. So for that reason, there can be no sound argument, none that I can think of, that recovering these moral foundations of religious liberty, these truths about divine realities, human life, and the political common good, amount themselves to some sort of religious establishment. And we certainly should not suppose that Madison, for example, was foolish enough to argue for religious liberty in a memorial remonstrance on grounds that we would call or would sound to people like a religious establishment. Now, the founders resolved to let the spirit of human inquiry and judgment blow where it wills, in the end because they were obliged to do that. Obliged not by superior force or even, so far considered, by any revealed or revelatory act of God within human history. The founders were obliged by reason and conviction. They were compelled by truth. Now, the founders recognized two entailments, I'll call them, of what they wrought: their settlement, their experiment in religious liberty. One thing they recognize is this: unleashing the potentially disruptive forces of felt spiritual imperatives is risky. It is. So risky that no polity before theirs ever did it. Second, the founders recognized that in a free society like ours, the restraint, the virtue really necessary to good order, has to come from the character of the people, not from government dictates. At the intersection of these two lines of thought, these two entailments, stood religion. The founding generation all but universally held that the political commonweal, common good, depended upon the piety of the people. This is the message not only of Washington's justly famous farewell, the message of John Adams, it's the message also of Thomas Jefferson and pretty much everybody else at the founding. This pervasive judgment that religion supplies the ground for virtue, and virtue is necessary for freedom. This pervasive judgment, I would say, is not quite a moral foundation of religious liberty. I'd rather think of it as a morally adjacent truth of political wisdom. But there it is, nonetheless. Now, someone might now reheat an anti-establishment objection and serve it up right here against what I've been saying. Someone might say these affirmations about divine realities, etc., lack, if they're a basis for government action, lack a secular purpose, which is required for every government action. Now, this was indeed a demand, for an unfortunate season, of the Supreme Court's late, and I dare say unlamented, Establishment Clause test, the infamous three-part Lemon test, which was a gigantic mistake, which Justice Scalia 30 years ago likened, in his usual colorful language, Scalia speaking, the Lemon test is like a ghoul in a late-night horror movie that repeatedly sits up in its grave and shuffles abroad after being repeatedly killed and buried. Well, to continue with the colorful prose, finally the Lemon test has a stake buried through its heart, and it's really, really dead now. Now, the secular purpose objection, the secular purpose part of the Lemon test for that matter, I think is, in any event, question-begging wordplay. The wordplay goes like this. You see, religious and secular are opposites. So if government should act for the sake of religion, they must not be acting for a secular purpose, even if acting for religion opens onto or produces what we might call secular prosperity in a wide sense. Well, we don't need to think that way, and the founders most certainly didn't think that way. Let's instead work with the founders' words and concepts and think about government promoting religion for the sake of the common good. Now, the founders were keenly, even fearfully aware of the divide between this passing veil of tears and what they ubiquitously referred to as, the founders' terms, a future state of rewards and punishments. But the founders never used the term secular when they talked about religion and the polity. The closest they came to doing so was probably references to what they called worldly activities, which were mostly forbidden, on the Sabbath. For the founders, proper government care for the temporal common good included encouragement and help and recognition of religion, albeit always respectful of persons' freedom and churches' autonomy. In the founders' world, deploying the word secular would have added nothing to the discussion and probably confused everybody party to it. Now, in conclusion, I've spoken so far. I haven't really spoken specifically about constitutional interpretation of the religion clauses. And I should like to close by noting two takeaways from my remarks pertinent to constitutional interpretation. One is this. It's folly to think we can jettison what I've called the moral foundations of religious liberty and its moral adjacent, the people's virtue. I think it's folly to think we can jettison that is banish it from our thinking, and remain faithful to anything like the original understanding of the religion clauses. The other takeaway is that no matter what is true with other constitutional provisions, here at the keystone of our constitutional civil liberties, here with religious liberty, there is no need for the contemporary interpreter on or off a court, interpreter of the constitutional language, to choose between history and justice, to choose between historical recovery of the plain meaning of the text and what surely appears to be the moral truth of the matter. For in the case of the religion clauses, the founders wove truth into the text in a tapestry for the ages.
Thank you. Kelly?
I guess I have a question for each. First, Mark, first, thank you for literally a life of service for religious freedom and what you've done. I really do. I'm thankful for both of you. Mark, I want to start with you. I know Ms. Ho mentioned in her opening remarks this issue, and since you litigate in this area, of judges trying to avoid and creating things so that they don't rule for people in these cases. I'd just like you to give your experience on that, whether you think that's true, and then if there's any recommendation or anything you have that we could recommend to the president. I don't know if there is, but I think there could be. And then Professor Bradley, I know this afternoon we're going to get to more cases and all this, but you've had such a wide background on this. I would love to get your idea. You mentioned the Lemon case being overturned and our Kennedy case that we did a few years ago, but what do you think is the next big thing that should go if we're going to have more religious freedom? And then if you have any ideas how to move us in that way, I'd love that as well.
Thanks, Kelly. Happy to discuss it. There's something that I think is true of judges, but I think it's also true of people who work in all levels of state and federal government, which is sometimes you get up or sometimes you encounter a situation and you're just not all that eager to do the job. And I think one thing this commission can and should do is call on all of our public servants, and I really do think it's across the board, to remind them that they have an obligation, right? I mean, if you wear the robes or if you took the oath of office to be a state legislator or a federal legislator, or you work in the agency someplace, you have a duty to advance and uphold religious freedom for everyone. And that means you have a job to decide the hard cases and to work through the difficult situations. Nobody ever said this was all easy or simple. Nobody ever said every case was easy or simple. But nothing gets better when you kick those cans down the road and say, well, you know, we'll let a few more families get messed up or a few more churches get closed. That's not a win for anybody. So to the extent this commission can highlight those things and encourage people to really do the job, and letting things linger for a long time, you know, choosing to not decide to let parents have their rights to raise their children the way they want, for example, that's just harming people, and our whole system of government should do better.
Kelly, to put it bluntly, I think it's time to kick in the rotten door that's barring religion from the public square. And what I mean, maybe a little bit more helpfully than that, or less cryptically than that, over the last 20 years, the Supreme Court, at the behest or at the urging of people like Mark Rienzi, the Becket Fund, ADF, First Liberty, has issued a series of rulings that bit by bit have reintroduced religion into the public square. And finally, the court has overruled the Lemon Test, and it's the first part of it is government has to have a secular legislative purpose. But the Supreme Court has done everything to prepare the way for it to say something now, which it has yet to say and should say, which is that promoting religion for the sake of religion and its ulterior benefits to the polity is fine. To date, even with the many good decisions we've had in the 21st century, the Supreme Court would still is beholden to a view that I would describe as a kind of hangover of secularism, that it's always looking for a secular side benefit or collateral effect of action that government takes, which has in some way an effect of promoting religion. We're always looking to call legislative prayer, for example, a way to solemnize the occasion, for example, rather than say, we're praying here. So everything is set for the court to do that, and I think it should do that at the earliest opportunity.
Dr. Anderson?
Great, thank you. I thought both opening remarks were outstanding, and so thank you both to Mark and Jerry. And I have a question for each of you. Mark, at one point you mentioned just in passing that government can't violate religious liberty except for certain rare exceptions. And sometimes I think thinking about those exceptions can actually be really helpful for highlighting what the foundation is. The way that I've thought about this in my own kind of research and writing is that all of our natural liberties have natural limits. And so government isn't violating my natural right to free speech when it says you can't publish obscenity, because the right to free speech never included obscenity to begin with. Doesn't violate my liberty when it says you can't rape, pillage, and plunder, because I never had a liberty right to rape. So what are those natural limits to religious liberty? Just so we can think through, like, what is within the scope and what's outside of the bounds. And then, Jerry, I love your, some people want to have public religion but no liberty. Other people want to have liberty but no public religion. The founders wanted both. Can you help us think about how we've done that historically? How have we as a nation both promoted religion publicly and respected and protected religious liberty?
Thank you, Ryan. Here's the way I would suggest thinking about the limits on religious liberty. Like, when can the government force somebody to violate his or her religion? The short answer is it should be very, very rare. It should be where there's something the government needs to achieve, and the only way to do it is to force someone to violate his or her religion. So if my religion is to sacrifice children to Moloch or to drive the wrong way on the Beltway when I get out of here this afternoon, I don't win that case, right? The government has a compelling reason to stop me, and it really has to stop me. Otherwise, I'm going to kill other people. Otherwise, I'm going to do something terribly dangerous. That's almost never the case in most religious liberty cases, because thankfully most people don't claim a religious right to kill their children or drive the wrong way on the Beltway. Here's one benefit to massive, overwhelming government that is involved in every aspect of every one of our lives, right? We probably all have different opinions on that. My opinion's kind of negative toward that. But here's a positive about it, right? The massive government that has 9,000 tentacles and has 50 zillion agencies you've never heard of, guess what? It can get its work done without forcing nuns to give out contraception. It can get its work done in almost every single case without forcing American citizens to violate their religion. And so in an era of big, powerful government, the answer is those limits are really rare because almost all the time the government can get its job done without coercing violations of faith.
So the best way I can answer your question, Ryan, is to take two traditions, which are vibrant traditions from the founding on until sometime within the memory of some people still living, like me. Now, these are two traditions that have been battered and limited and diminished by Supreme Court decisions, other court decisions, government action of a general kind, and also the cultural drift away from religious observance. But I think both of these traditions are still alive and should be revivified. Now, one is just a tradition of public recognition of truths about divine realities, starting with prayer in legislative assemblies, chaplains in the military, but also in public speeches and public expression. I mean, it's not that long ago where the terminology of providence and, for the most part, in fact, biblical faith, were a part of political discourse. And I don't mean just the high points like Lincoln's second inaugural, which is justly famous for its sort of awful rendition of providence and divine judgment. But there is a tradition of recognition of these truths of philosophy, very often called natural religion, which were part of the civic furniture for hundreds of years, and now remain almost as bleached or whited sepulchres. So as I said, not puckishly to Kelly, more seriously, the Supreme Court has upheld legislative prayer on the ground that it's not really prayer. It's a kind of sacred-sounding verbal salad, which has the effect intended to settle down people, to signal the meeting is beginning, and solemnize the occasion. So we could revivify this tradition, but not be embarrassed by it. And the other is to continue, revivify, but continue the tradition of what you could call government-religious partnerships, which are present at the beginning, and at a time, and for most of our history, the federal government, I know it's hard to believe for people present, the federal government's budget wasn't in the trillions back in the Washington administration. The federal government had very little infrastructure or capacity to do anything that we would call social service work by itself. So there was a tradition from the founding until the day before yesterday of creative partnership between government and religion, religious groups, religious bodies, to supply social services, education, etc. Now that should be done, and all of this should be done with respect for people's freedom. So none of this suggests in the slightest, or I don't think it should suggest in the slightest, that Jehovah's Witnesses school children should actually be compelled to salute the flag after all, because they're truths of natural religion. No, but all of this should be respectful of people's freedom and also of a kind of non-discrimination among the religious groups. But both of those traditions have enough life in them, enough of a pulse, that they could be revivified and should be, and would be with less effort if the Supreme Court finally pivoted and said, you know what, we're kicking in the rotten door. It's fine if government works with religion, even for the sake of religion.
Dr. Carson, and then Rabbi, and then Allison.
Well, thank you both for very enlightening answers. I have a question for each of you, but either can feel free to weigh in on the other's question too. For Mr. Renze, you say we can learn a lot from what's happened in the past. The Puritans were basically good people, and they wanted everybody to be good people. So they kind of decided who would be the good people and what the criteria were for that. And they punished people who didn't necessarily comply with that. What happened to them to make them so intolerant, and what can we learn from that? And then for Gerald Bradley,
is it possible for the government to promote religion without infringing upon the rights of others?
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Yeah, the Puritans are humans, right? They're humans like the rest of us are humans, and they succumbed to what I think is a very common temptation that in many ways the American experiment fights against, right? So the Puritans come over here seeking religious freedom, but then when they get here, right, they don't necessarily provide it to people who have different beliefs from them, and they're bad to the Quakers, among others, when they get here. A similar thing happened in Maryland, which is established initially with religious tolerance and then kind of flips back and forth. So I think our early history shows that there's a long-standing aspect of human nature that says when you're thinking about religious truth and you say, I have figured it out and I know the truth, then you say it's my job to stop the other guy from doing other. And I think that's a bad path, and I think one of the great achievements of our country is that we eventually kind of, restrained that aspect of human nature and said, actually, everyone should be able to freely seek God and freely, as Jerry was citing James Madison, freely respond to the duty to the Creator, and that the power of government shouldn't be crushing someone who has the wrong views. And I will say that strain of human nature, right, which was initially wielded by the Puritans against the Quakers and others, and I think it originally comes from fervent religious belief, right? Conviction that you're right, and therefore I must crush the guy who's wrong. That has lasted, but these days, frankly, I don't think it so much comes from religious people trying to use government to stamp out people with unpopular views. I think it's now more often anti or a-religious folks who want to wield the government to stamp out views that are wrong. And I think the truth is, whether it's the religious people or the opponents of religion, it's wrong, and it's wonderful that the United States has moved away from that, and we should continue trying.
Well, it's a not only a terrific question, it's a question. How does a government which takes my advice and decides to reclothe the public square with religion avoid violating the rights of people? Maybe especially non-believers, but let's just say the rights of people. And that is the kind of thing where I think if I were watching a TV commercial, this is where it would say, this is an expert driver. Don't try this at home. That is to say, before you try to promote religion, you better give a lot of thought to how you're going to do it without compromising people's rights. Now, I think it can be done, but it is something that has to be considered carefully for the very good reason that Madison cited. I mean, I don't think God wants insincere religious worship. I don't myself think God wants people to worship because that's what's done around here. I think worship that's pleasing to God, this is my own conviction. I don't know what Madison for sure thought, but my own conviction is that's what God wants. He wants people to freely come to God with conviction, owning their religion, believing in what they're doing. So you might say, I think believers need to constitute themselves and own their religion, and that can't be done save freely. So for the sake of religion, it is religious freedom. But one way that we can promote, I think we can see our way to promote religion respectful of freedom, but in a way that doesn't compromise anybody's rights, is to maybe repackage something that Madison said. He certainly held it, and what I was trying to say, which is this: we should come to recognize religion as a common good, even if not everybody's religious. And even if some people, maybe they're not religious, don't think religion is a common good. Quite a lot like education. I mean, we do think of education as a common good, and government does a great deal to supply it, promote it, and pay for it. I'm not saying that's exactly what we should do with religion, but even people who don't believe in education or think that universities are half frauds and half dangerous, any number of people may have reasons to think that education as it's practiced today is not a common good, but really just what some people have managed to get the government to pay for them. But I think that's false. No matter what you think of today's educational system, having an educated citizenry is good for all of us. It's good for democracy. And as the founders most certainly did think, and I think, having a religious and virtuous citizenry is good for everybody, frankly, even people who lack virtue and don't believe in religion.
Yes, Dr. Phil?
In the interest of just kind of having a conversation before we move on to the next question, can I ask a follow-up here?
Yes, of course.
Because we're talking about the government promoting religion, and that kind of gets a little scary sometimes, promoting, because nobody's a blank slate, and excuse me, and everybody comes to a situation with a bias. Nobody is bias-free. Everybody has some preconceived notion of an issue when they come to it, and when you see people behaving some way in pattern, then those in power are either eliciting, maintaining, or allowing that in some way. They're not neutral. They're either eliciting it, or they're doing something to maintain what's already happening, or they're at least passively allowing it to go on. There's some role. You cannot not choose. Not choosing is a choice, right? That's the fifth choice. You can come to the crossroads out in the middle of the country. You can go left, right, back, or forward, or you can just stand in the middle of the intersection and get run over. That's the fifth choice. You cannot not choose. So, and when you say to promote, are we talking about promoting religion, or are we talking about promoting liberty to choose religion if that's what you choose? Because if we're promoting religion, that's different than promoting choice. And I'm curious, what is it we're promoting? If you're saying promote.
Well, I think I might disagree with you. I think I understand what you're asking, and it deserves a better and a richer answer than I can give it, at least in these time constraints. But I don't think I agree with you that there's a tension or a difficulty with envisioning promoting religion at the same time you're promoting its free observance and appropriation by people. And an example that may be illuminating, it's not an analog, but it's something similar, would be family and marriage. I mean, the government, a political community ought to promote marriage and family as good things and help people who choose to be married and to have a family successfully do so. So there are aids to education of children and all sorts of possibilities for benefiting married couples. But nobody has to get married. In our country, you're free to reject marriage. You're free to think marriage is just another scam by the man. You're free to do that. But nonetheless, I think we do promote marriage and family. We should promote marriage and family. But I think it's fair to say you're free to decide that for yourself. Not only in terms of getting married, but also whether you agree with the government's promotion of marriage as a good thing. You may think it's not.
But are you saying that's true for religion as well, that we should promote religion, but yet people are free not to do it if they want to?
Pretty much. I mean,
I
promote it
agree.
as a good thing. It's a good thing, but it's not. It's only a good thing if people choose to buy into it. Education, to some extent,
I for
is that
one
way, too.
think my bias is that religion is a good thing.
Yeah.
And for the first time in our country's history, participation in organized religion has dropped below 50% for the first time in our country's history. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and probably the most operative is that our birth rate has dropped so low, and one of the primary reasons people join the church is to have their children baptized or whatever. So that may be the most operative reason, but nonetheless, it's dropped below 50% for the first time in our country's history, which I think is a very sad reality, because that's a great glue, as I said earlier, that holds the family together, and they worship together, and there's also the sense of community that comes with that quiet time together and coming together as a community. So I personally have, my bias is that it's a good thing. but I don't know that everybody would share that. That would be my bias if I was bringing it to the situation.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. Rabbi?
Thank you, Chairman. Excuse me. I'd like to explore, building on the eloquent testimony of both witnesses, the connection between free exercise right and other aspects of the Bill of Rights. So, Mr. Rienzi, you movingly referred to the story of the Gobitis case and then the Barnett rectification of Gobitis. So let's use that for a moment to explore the connection between free exercise and free speech. In one of the lamentable religious liberty decisions by the court that still has yet to go, Employment Division versus Smith, the majority in that case argued, among other things, that the Barnett case, the pledging allegiance case or saluting the flag case, is a special case because it is what the court called one of hybrid rights. It involves not only religious liberty but also freedom of speech, to which Michael McConnell, I think, rightly responded that, in truth, acts of religious exercise are very often, if not almost always, also forms of expression. If I am wearing a yarmulke or one is wearing a cross, obviously one is not just engaging in a form of religious observance, but of expression of faith. Pastor White referred movingly to the case of one being prosecuted for silently praying, which is, of course, both a case of religious liberty as well as speech. So I'm interested in the intersection of religious liberty and religious speech. And then regarding Professor Bradley's testimony, which I'm entirely in sympathy with in terms of rediscovering a better understanding of the role of faith in society and government's role in helping to bring about that. I'd love some thoughts on what would a better understanding of the Constitution's reference to a prohibition on religious establishment actually be. Members of the Commission have themselves referred to, as Tocqueville did, the importance of the separation between what my colleagues called altar and throne in America. On the other hand, we've clearly gone wrong somewhere. I think George Washington, who wrote that wonderful letter to the Jews of Newport, would be a kind of surprised to learn that the Supreme Court had decided that, say, a rabbi giving a non-denominational prayer in high school graduation, or a state legislature creating a school district to help special needs Hasidic children, was considered by the courts a dangerous encroachment on constitutional boundaries, and yet we've had those decisions. So, what would a better understanding of the reference to religious establishment be, and how would that relate to a better facilitation of faith in the public square? Mr. Rienzi, maybe we'll begin with you.
Yeah, so Justice Scalia, who wrote the Smith decision, which was a mistake, in a different decision said, a free speech clause without religious speech is like Hamlet without the prince. And he was right then. He was wrong in Smith, but he's right. He was right about speech. Free speech, parental rights, all sorts of other rights are very, very closely tied to religious liberty. And when you cut back on religious liberty, you endanger the others. Religious liberty also can't just be an equality right. It can't just be, we got to treat everybody the same. That would work if we all had one religion. If we all had the same religion, then treating us all exactly the same would protect each of our free exercise. Like that would be fine in a place where we were twins. But we're not, right? This is a religiously diverse place, and so to protect religious liberty for a religiously diverse people, you're going to need to protect something different for the Muslim and for the Jew and for the Native American and for the Catholic and for the Protestant and everybody else. And so when we artificially shrink our rights down, and when we cut them down to something like just an equality principle, and we don't give full protection to the free exercise of different religious faiths, we're really shortchanging the religious liberty right, but also things like speech and parental rights that are really the bedrock of our civilization.
Thank you.
Members, we're pushing the clock just a little bit here on our first set of witnesses, and we just want to stay on time. So Allison and the bishop will close it. And is everybody else okay? Paula, do you have a question? Allison?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ideas have consequences, and what happens in the ivory hallways of the academy and courtrooms doesn't stay there. It has real impacts on real people. And I was struck that both of you, when you were referring to religion, Mr. Renzi, you spoke of it as a freedom to live out our faith. Professor Bradley, you talked about acting on what one believes. And it seems to me there's a misconception that religion in the clauses is really limited to worship. And I think that really expands the power of government and how it can intrude on the sphere. At the same time, it shrinks individual liberty and freedom. So I just wanted I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that problem and what we can do to sort of restore a more proper and capacious understanding of religion.
I'll just say simply that, one, that's a great point, and one that it would be great for this commission to work on emphasizing and making in public quite a bit. And the easiest answer is that the word is exercise, right? It's the free exercise of religion, which means not just you get to believe whatever you want in your head, but you get to act like it's true within very, very broad limits, right? For the most part, you get to do that. And so if we're going to protect the free exercise of different religious beliefs, we're going to have to give room for people to act on them. And I agree with you, sometimes our courts historically have had a much smaller scope for that, right? You can believe what you want, you can tell your kids when they get home that they were sinning, but when I get them back in the schoolhouse, I get to make them do what I want. That's not liberty.
I think it's probably true, Commissioner Hode, that at the founding and for a long time thereafter, public worship was the quintessential religious activity or central religious activity. There was a way in which it had a certain priority of visibility and perhaps importance. So there is some reason to treat it as primary, but not any reason I can think of that's a good reason to treat it as somehow exclusively what religion's about. Religion really, I think, is about self-constitution, vis-a-vis transcendent source of meaning and value, and whatever one holds that to be. So it really involves organizing your entire life around a connection and an attempt to be in harmony with God or the transcendent principle or whatever you call it. Now, obviously, there are a dramatic number of limits on anybody's freedom to do what they want, but I do think that there is a material in our tradition that should be emphasized, and it goes all the way back to the founding, of religion being a kind of encompassing part, not an encompassing part, but really the encompassing canopy of one's entire perspective and existence. Again, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any anarchic implications. There's order and there's respecting other people's rights, to be sure, but I think we should treat worship as, maybe even today, somehow prototypical or central, but it's a mistake to make it the sum and substance of religion. And it's just a mistake.
Bishop? And if on your answers, you can give us good answers now a little bit at the end. You guys have been terrific, so just we'll make a little succinct. Bishop?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the two presentations. I found them both really stimulating. As you were talking, I kept thinking about the great Vatican II statement, Dignitatis Humanae, on religious liberty, one of whose principal architects was the great Jesuit John Courtney Murray, who argued a long time ago that the principles of natural law provide a sort of basis for peace among, let's say, the potentially warring religions. A sort of common moral consensus, natural religion, if you want, and all that. It seems to me everyone around this table would kind of hold to the principles of natural law. But you also cited the infamous Casey decision in 1992. It belongs to the nature of liberty to decide the meaning of my own life and the meaning of the universe, this wildly over-the-top statement, which is now, it seems to me, the default position of almost every teenager in America, right? I decide everything. Here's my question. What do we do when the natural law consensus has evanesced? which I think it largely has among a lot of people in our country. Because religious liberty, as we've been talking about it, as the founders talked about it, as John Courtney Murray talked about it, is grounded in this shared consensus. What do we do? I think that's our challenge. What do we do when Casey versus Planned Parenthood is now the default position of most people?
You fight back against it with truth. The truth is the Casey principle is an empty thing to organize your life around, and you stand up and you say it as often as you can until people see it and realize it.
I agree. I mean, I think the Casey principle is basically, it's a value judgment. It's not in any way neutral. The value judgment is everything that counts in what you do and what you believe is authenticity, that it's really you. What it is you believe and do doesn't much matter at all as far as value is concerned. It's all about your individuality and asserting your stance and identity. I think besides refuting it with truth, and this is maybe not in a way helpful advice, but I think we're seeing it sort of run its course already. It's demonstrating itself to be an empty promise of creativity and authenticity. It's actually a dead end and kind of a prison of emotion and something else. So, and again, I wish that the end of this course would come sooner rather than later, but I dare say we're on a course, it's on a course to a kind of extinction.
Last quick point I'd make is if you want to figure out what's been wrong for the last 30 or 40 years in our law, it was that Casey gives that view of liberty at the same time that, until the last 15 years, we had a stingy view of religious liberty that was actually directly protected in the text of the Constitution. That's a problem. That's something this commission should help us straighten out.
I am going to recognize Carrie because you were way in the queue earlier and I missed you, so go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to know about the Supreme Court case in 1962, the prayer case. Do you believe, I would like both of you to answer, do you believe and recognize that after that case, we saw a significant decline in morality? We saw suicide rates increase, we saw teenage pregnancies increase, we saw divorce rates increase. Do you believe that prayer should be included in school as it was for 200 years when the students used to read the New England Primer and obviously have prayer in school and have the Bible as their textbook? What significance do you believe and detriment did the 1962 Supreme Court case have on all Americans?
Well, I myself treat that case, apart from the particular context prayer in schools, which, as you're saying, or suggesting is an immensely consequential thing. I do think that was the real declaration of independence by the justices from the constitutional tradition. They had indicated this direction as early as 1947, but the Engel case in 1962 is where the Supreme Court just cuts itself off from the tradition and declares itself the harbinger or custodian of secularism. So I think it's a bad decision for that reason. The other thing I say, I don't myself know what the consequences or what cause and effect is with regard to the consequences after 1962, and I don't dispute or wonder about anything you said. But I would add this, that the Engel case, which is the 62 school prayer case, I should say, the Supreme Court decided that on the assumption, they took it over as their given, that it was truly voluntary prayer. Now, some people may doubt that that's the way it works in a grade school classroom, but the Supreme Court decided that case on the grounds that it was voluntary prayer, which would have to be in light of the Barnett case from 1943. And the content of the prayer in 1962, the New York Regent's prayer, was wasn't anything more than a short collection, compact collection of the truths that Madison and all of the founders affirmed. Almighty God, we thank you and we implore your blessings upon our country, our families, and our community. Almighty God, we give our thanks to you. And it really is just a recognition of God's existence and providential care for humankind. So it wasn't a prayer that should be called sectarian. Even in contrast to the 1963 case, the Schempp case, which had to do with Bible reading from the King James Version of the Bible. That's actually a different situation. but the New York Regent's prayer case, Engel, I think, was a sharp, bad turn at several levels of thinking about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. I just have one quick question with a short answer, if you can. Almost every decision that has been made regarding religious liberty has come from the courts. Almost every decision that has taken the wrong turn at the court level. The founders believe this should be left to the states and the state legislatures. Do you believe if the courts had stayed out of this, which they had for a long time, and left to the will of those elected by the people, that the legislators in this country would have made these same decisions and passed these same laws? And I say that coming from Texas, where we just passed Senate Bill 10 to put the 10 Commandments in every classroom, and Senate Bill 11 to put prayer voluntarily back in our schools. Because I question if the Congress or if state legislatures would have done what the courts have done.
I don't know if they would have done what the courts have done either, but I'd caution that I think it's a dangerous world to say we want the courts out of these things. I think the point of the Bill of Rights is that there are some principles that everybody's supposed to apply, but the courts ultimately do need to protect and step in occasionally. The law in Gobitis was from a local school board and legislature too, so I think sometimes those entities will get it right, sometimes they will get it wrong, but I do think we need a system that protects minority rights and sort of ensures that they get it right. All that said, courts obviously quite often get it exactly wrong, and that's dangerous, and that's why we have to work hard to fix it.
Yeah, I think there's an essential, an important role for courts. I agree completely with Mark Rienzi. The only thing I would add is an adaptation of something that is attributed at least to Bill Buckley, which was Bill Buckley said at one point he'd rather be ruled by the first 200 people in the Cambridge phone book than the Harvard faculty. My adaptation of it is to say, I think over the last 2 generations, we would have been much better off, all told, with regard to religion, if the people had had more to say about how we would integrate religion in public life than the courts, in fact, have had over the last 2 generations.
Well, and Harvard is obviously still a problem. I want to thank our 2 witnesses. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. You may be excused. I'm checking because I can't quite see, it's dark backstage, if our Attorney General is here yet. Do I have any staff update on that? Our next witness is Dr. Mark David Hall, a professor of Regent University School of Government and an acclaimed expert in American political theory and church-state relations. Dr. Hall has authored or co-edited a dozen books on topics central to religious freedom. His work will provide essential context as we examine our founders' vision for religious freedom. Mark?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chairman. Is this on? All right, fantastic. Well, and thank you, members of the Commission, for your very important work. It's my honor to be before you today. So I've been asked to say a few words about the original understanding of religious liberty and church-state relations. And as a scholar, I'm happy just to do that. But my wife is always getting after me, why is it relevant? In this area of law, it's particularly relevant. If we go back to 1947, Everson versus the Board of Education, Hugo Black for the majority and Wiley Rutledge for the dissent insisted that we must interpret what they called the religion clause in light of its generating history. A few years ago, I wrote a law review article where I went through every single religion clause decision of the United States Supreme Court, and I find that basically everyone is an originalist when it comes to the First Amendment. But there's a key difference between conservative and progressive justices. Conservatives tend to get the history right. Progressives tend to get the history wrong. And so I think in this area of law, it really is important to get it right. So let me begin with religious liberty. And an important thing to note just from the get-go is that in the ancient world, religious liberty simply does not exist. It is simply assumed that the community will share a religion and that rulers will enforce that religion and punish dissenters from it. Robert Louis Wilkins, in a wonderful book, Religious Liberty and the Things of God, demonstrates that it's really the early church that comes up with this idea of religious liberty. You could begin with Jesus Christ himself, give unto Caesar what is Caesar, unto God what is God's. Tertullian, the early church father, is the first person to ever use the phrase religious liberty. And yet Wilkin recognizes, as he must, that when Christians came into political power, they succumbed to the temptation of using the power of the state, the power of civil rulers, to promote their understanding of true religion. And so from Emperor Constantine up to the early American colonies, it was too often the case that rulers would favor one manifestation of Christianity over others, punish dissenters, and this sort of thing. Unfortunately, very fortunately, things began to change in the 17th century. Now, we're oftentimes told a tale that religious liberty comes about for prudential reasons. People get tired of fighting each other over religion, or maybe the Enlightenment comes along and saves us from our bigotry. And there's something to both of these things, especially the prudential argument. But very, very important, I think, are arguments made by men like Roger Williams, William Penn, Isaac Backus, John Leland, Elisha Williams, people making explicitly Christian and biblical arguments in favor of the sacred right of conscience. Now, there are other sorts of arguments one could make, including excellent moral arguments, but in early America, where something like 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestant, 2% are Roman Catholic, and you have about 2,500 Jews in 4 or 5 American cities, these sorts of biblical arguments were very, very persuasive. So by the time we get to the late 18th century, and well, especially during the First Great Awakening, those great series of revivals that swept America in the 1730s, 1740s, where a lot of these arguments were made. But by the time we get to the founding era, we have seen a major shift. So in the early colonies, again, you don't really have religious liberty. Sometimes you have religious toleration. Sometimes you don't, right? Jews and Catholics are banned from both Massachusetts Bay and Virginia, for example. And yet by the time we get to the founding era, something had changed. All colonies had come to accept religious toleration. We'll put up with dissenters. And yet they're moving beyond that. They're moving to embrace religious liberty as a natural right. Let me give you my favorite illustration of this. So as the American colonies are breaking from Great Britain, pretty much every state rewrites its constitution and laws. In Virginia, George Mason was tasked with writing a Bill of Rights, and he came up with a religious liberty provision that's not bad. He writes that religion or the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration of the exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, unpunished and unrestrained by the magistrate. Now, that's not a bad religious liberty provision, but James Madison, in his first public act, he objects to that word toleration. He says that makes it sound as if we're just going to put up with you religious minorities. And he insisted instead that that provision that word be replaced to make it crystal clear that people have a natural right to the free exercise of religion. And the convention went along with Madison. And what we see in the founding era is that every state is coming to protect religious liberty, and it's very common to have language like George Mason's. Note that he's making an argument. He's not saying for prudential reasons or because the Enlightenment is now here. He's saying because we have a duty to our divine and omnipotent Creator, a duty that must be exercised in freedom and truth. Therefore, we must have this right. So every state is protecting religious liberty. The federal Constitution does not, but only because its advocates said the federal government simply does not have the power to restrict religious liberty. The Anti-Federalists were not convinced, and so they insisted on a Bill of Rights, and fortunately they did. And of course we end up with the First Amendment, which begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The free exercise thereof. And we talked a little bit about earlier, I think it's crystal clear, it's absolutely clear that religious liberty protects more than the freedom of worship. It clearly protects it. It clearly protects freedom of belief, clearly protects freedom of worship, but it protects more. And to get into this, what I want to look at a little bit is religious accommodations or religious exceptions. So when you have a neutral law of general applicability, does the First Amendment require an exception? Now, that is hotly contested even among originalists, and I'm not going to go down that path right now, but I want to make the point that the founders absolutely understood about religious exceptions or accommodations. The Constitution itself contains one, right? In each and every oath provision, people are given the ability to swear or affirm the oath. And the affirmation possibility is clearly aimed at Quakers and others who have religious scruples to swearing oaths. But I want to talk about something else, something even our libertarian friends would agree with. If the government has one job, it's national defense. It's protecting either the colony, the state, or the nation. Now, how have governments gone about doing this? Well, in early America, especially the early American colonies, generally they required militia service. Every male must serve in the militia. And yet again, you have those problematic Quakers and Brethren and Amish, and they say, we can't do this. We have religious objections to military service. Well, think about this from the government's perspective. What can the government do? It seems to me there's three obvious choices. One, a government could say, well, we really care about not making anyone go against his conscience, so we'll remove this requirement altogether. No one has to serve in the military. And yet, if conscription is really necessary for the national defense or colonial defense, and it really probably was for the early colonies, then you're putting the community in jeopardy by removing this requirement. Well, another possibility would be to say the law is the law. Everyone will serve, period. Too many countries do this, right? Can you imagine a Quaker saying to Vladimir Putin, excuse me, I can't serve in the Russian military. I have a religious objection. That person would probably not be long on this earth. Many countries have done this. Fortunately, in America, we have found a third way. Beginning as early as the 1670s, what colonies would do is they would permit Quakers and others to do alternative service or to hire a substitute or something like this. And by the time you get to the late 18th century, every colony and then every state is doing this. Congress affirms this in a statement of July 18, 1775. Congress said, as there are some people who, from religious principles, cannot bear arms in any case, this Congress intend no violence to their consciences, but earnestly recommend it to them to contribute liberally in this time of universal calamity to the relief of their distressed brethren in every several colonies, and to do other services to their oppressed country which they can consistently with their religious principles. And that's an important point. Religious liberty is not a get-out-of-duty-free card. You still have to serve, but we'll permit you to serve in a different way. Well, I could give a lot more evidence along these lines, but let me shift to a different question. Who is protected? And we've already talked about this a little bit, but I think it's very critical to understand that even in the late 18th century, America's founders understood that the answer to that is everyone. And so Article 6 of the Constitution bans religious tests for office. And anti-federalists objected. They said, well, this means a Jew or a Muslim or even an atheist could hold federal office. And the Federalists had to say, yes, that's a possibility. Now, they would oftentimes go on to say, well, that's unlikely to ever happen. And, of course, they didn't understand how diverse our country has become, but they recognize it's a possibility. What I want to do instead is quote from, it's already been mentioned, but it's such a good letter, we should quote from it more than once, George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, I've already said there's only about 2,500 Jews in America at the time. They really don't have much by way of political or economic power. This is not a constituency that needs to be cultivated. But George Washington wrote to this tiny religious minority, all possess alike liberty and conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. A beautiful letter, a beautiful sentiment, an important commitment. But Washington goes on, and this will bring me to my last point. Washington goes on to write this. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercy scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations usefully here, in his own due time in every way everlastingly happy. So there are 9 separate allusions to Scripture in this short paragraph, including to Micah 4:4, which was George Washington's favorite verse. And this highlights the last point I want to make. The founders were committed to religious liberty, but in no way, shape, or form did they think that religion must be scrubbed from the public square. Now, jurists and academics, we could go back to Hugo Black in that 1947 decision. He sees this on a metaphor from Thomas Jefferson, from a letter Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association, where he talks about a wall of separation between church and state. And this is erroneous history that was embraced by far too many justices, far too many academics, far too many scholars, I'm sorry to say. Is this a useful metaphor? I want to suggest it is not. It's not even useful for Thomas Jefferson. You can see why the metaphor is appealing. It's one of the few documents that you could look at from this era to support anything approximating the strict separation of church and state. Jefferson, I'll skip ahead here because I'm running out of time, as a member of the Continental Congress, Jefferson proposed that the nation adopt a seal containing the image of Moses, extending his hand over the sea, casting to overwhelm Pharaoh, and the motto of the United States would be rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Literally 2 days after Jefferson wrote this letter to the Danbury Baptist, he went to church services in the U.S. Capitol building, where he heard John Leland, the great Baptist itinerant minister and himself an opponent of establishments, preach. Jefferson also made the War Department building and the Treasury Department building available for church services. Now, my point is not that Jefferson was an Orthodox Christian who wanted a close cooperation between church and state. He was not an Orthodox Christian, and he wanted a greater degree of separation between church and state than almost any other founder. But in his own accents, he did not act as if there was a wall of separation between church and state. And if we turn from Jefferson to the rest of the founders, we find no historical evidence that the founders wanted any sort of separation between church and state. So I will stop there, and I would be happy to take questions, or as you will, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And Paula?
Thank you so much, Chairman, and thank you for your work and your clarity. Can you tell us what the Establishment Clause means, and have the courts gotten off on that?
Thank you very much for that question. If you think about the metaphor, the wall of separation between church and state, it really does not communicate at all the words of the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That is a unilateral barrier. It's a restriction on Congress, and through the doctrine of incorporation, now the states. In no way, shape, or form is it a restriction on churches or synagogues or mosques or any other sort of religious organization. But the wall of separation metaphor, that suggests a bilateral barrier, right? That it's a restriction on government, but it's also a restriction on religion. In no way, shape, or form is it that. I've already suggested in 1947, Hugo Black and Wiley Rutledge led us astray by adopting this wall of separation metaphor as a defining historical document to inform what the First Amendment means. One problem with that metaphor is no one ever really believed it, right? If you really take it literally, fire departments can't put out fires in churches, and churches are somehow free of building codes? No one ever argued that. And so, if it's not going to be a wall, what will it be? And the court basically came up with a flawed analytical test known as the Lemon test that did a lot of damage until it was finally eliminated a few years ago in the Coach Kennedy case.
Dr. Anderson?
Yeah, thank you. Mark, I want to ask, right at the end when you were speaking about the flawed analogy of separation of church and state, this may be a historical period that stretches you beyond the founding, but I'm thinking of the civil rights movement, and I'm thinking of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his letter from the Birmingham jail, where he cites 2 Christian saints, first St. Augustine to say an unjust law is no law at all, and then St. Thomas Aquinas to say, how do we know the difference? A just law is a man-made code that's in harmony with the natural and the eternal law. Now, there's a certain, people for the separation of church and state who would claim that he was, in essence, calling upon the government to violate the separation of church and state. John Rawls works himself into all sorts of knots trying to figure out how we account for this in his proviso of, the concept of public reason. How would the founders have understood what MLK was doing? And do you see any problem with it? I mean, how has this played out in American history with people seeing there's actually, I don't want to say there's a porousness, but the church can speak to the state can speak to the church. It's meant to be a dialogue.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. And again, if you took literally this metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state, and then perhaps it's inappropriate for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to be advocating for change for Christian reasons, and it would be wrong for a member of Congress to vote for the Civil Rights Act because he believed or she believed that it was required by faith or Christian morality. The founders would have thought this was utter nonsense, and it's fine to begin in the 1950s or 60s, but of course you could go back to the founding era where many founders are coming to oppose slavery. Many founders never owned slaves. Many of those who did freed them voluntarily. John Dickinson, at one time the largest slave owner in Delaware, voluntarily freed all his slaves. And you have members of the founding generation like Ben Franklin, John Jay, that are leading manumission societies. 8 states voluntarily put slavery on the road to extinction. And believe me, these guys are making explicitly Christian arguments, as are the abolitionists of the 19th century, as are the civil rights leaders of the 20th century, from the early 20th century to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and thank goodness they were. So in no way, shape, or form would any founder have thought this would be inappropriate. Now, you had some founders, of course, and we should be clear about this, and some Christians throughout American history who made Christian arguments in favor of slavery, Christian arguments in favor of Jim Crow legislation. We have to recognize its reality and then engage these folks. And if they still exist today, engage them today and say, no, you're wrong. Christianity does not require it. In fact, the exact opposite.
Next question. Rabbi? And Bishop will come to you next, right? Rabbi?
Just to build on the previous question, so in rediscovering a better understanding of the relationship between government, religion, constitution of faith, so what would the Establishment Clause mean? In other words, we know clearly something has gone awry. Right? It doesn't mean, and I think Madison would be somewhat surprised to hear that it's being utilized to prohibit the placing of 10 commandments in schools, or to learn that the Supreme Court is deciding by 5-4 decisions in which one justice breaks the vote by saying, well, I like these 10 commandments here, but not here, because here it's just a history, or it's more guidelines than commandments, but here it's commandments, and so forth. So what would it be, and if we're applying, as you said, the doctrine of incorporation, applied to both Congress and to the states, Congress or states legislation shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. What would violate that?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the simplest answer to that is the words mean what they say. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So Congress, and by extension states, cannot establish a faith. Now that kind of begs the question, what then is an establishment of religion? Clearly it would involve taking tax dollars and giving them to just one denomination or one religion, to give them only to Orthodox Jews. That would be an establishment of religion. Here's a trivia question. You can win money in a cocktail party for this. When was a church disestablished in Virginia? Almost everyone would say the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, 1786, and yet in 1784, the House of Burgesses told the Anglican Church in Virginia how it was to govern itself. And it did not repeal this law until 1787. And so this would be another manifestation of an established religion, when the state tells a religion how it's going to govern itself. Yeah, we want the government out of that sort of business.
So you're arguing that, interestingly, that the Establishment Clause is actually there to protect faith itself and faith communities.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, one could argue that there's ways in which a subsidy of one manifestation, you still have others that are free to worship. And what's interesting, by the time you get to the founding era, where most states are actually moving away from the idea that only one denomination, say, would be subsidized. So Patrick Henry's General Assessment Bill would have had people taxed to support the church they chose to attend. So Anglicans taxed to support Anglican churches, Baptist churches, and so on. So you could have a multiple establishment. But I think it's fair to say that the Establishment Clause is saying, government, get out of that business altogether. The most persuasive arguments, I think, in these debates are that establishments hurt true religion. Whenever the government runs something, that does not work out well for whatever is being run. So get the government out, let churches and eventually other religious groups govern themselves, run themselves, be free of state subsidy, and things will be far better. Not perfect, but far better.
Thank you.
Bishop?
It's kind of a curiosity question in a way. When I was coming of age, we heard a lot about the wall of separation. We tended to read things through the lens of Thomas Jefferson. And you and many others have helped us to see it's a much more textured story. In some ways, Jefferson is very egregious among the founders. Part of my question, how do you explain that? Is it Jefferson's reliance upon the French sort of understanding of revolution? Is it more the laïcité approach? And have we been wrong all these years in a way trying to read our system through that more French revolutionary lens? Is that part of what explains Jefferson's egregious character?
You know, if I had had more time, I would have given a lot more examples of Thomas Jefferson really not acting in any way, shape, or form as if there actually was a wall of separation between church and state. And so one possible explanation that my friend Daniel Dreisbach of American University argues is even in this metaphor, Jefferson really was thinking more in terms of federalism, that Congress is barred from having anything to do with religious establishments in the state, but it's absolutely not problematic for Thomas Jefferson as president to encourage people to pray with them, to go to worship services in Congress, to allow the War Department building to be used for church services, and on you could go. Now, he probably was more suspicious of religion, especially Orthodox manifestations of religion, than almost any other founder. So he is influenced by the more radical Enlightenment, and probably is more of a secularist than most of the founders. But I think he's politically astute to know that if he acted or was too open with these sorts of views, he would get in trouble, and he did, right? When he says in the election of 1800 that, well, they're quoting the notes of the states of Virginia, it does me no harm if my neighbor believes there are three gods or two gods or no God. That really got a lot of backlash and really hurt him in that election. And so I think he kept he's not an Orthodox Christian, we know that, but he kept those views very, very private because America was a very, very Christian country at that time.
Questions on this row? Questions? Kelly? Oh, Dr. Phil, go ahead.
In talking about the Establishment Clause, the Supreme Court ruled in 1947 that the Establishment Clause, which limits what Congress can do, also limits what states can do. It did so by invoking the 14th Amendment, which says no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. But the Establishment Clause did not create a right in any individual, but rather protected the state's rights. So, and that's come into play now in Oklahoma and in Texas with St. Isidore. What is your position on that? Because it seems to me that they're saying that Congress shall make no rule. It doesn't say anything about states. In fact, it leaves it to the states, does it not?
So everyone understood that the Bill of Rights originally was only a restriction on the national government. There's really no question about that. The only question comes when we have the 14th Amendment, where the relevant section begins, the relevant article, no state shall, ... abridge the privileges or immunities abridge due process. And it's through that due process clause that the U.S. Supreme Court, one by one, applied the Bill of Rights to the states. Now, there are scholars and jurists who argue that this entire doctrine is flawed, and we should just be done with it altogether, and the state of Virginia would no longer be restricted by the freedom of speech, freedom of press, free exercise of religion. There are scholars who make that argument. I'm a little bit sympathetic to it, but I'm enough of a Burkean conservative to say that we have lived under this doctrine from so long that that ship has sailed, that we're stuck with it. Now, with the Establishment Clause, there is an additional argument, which is that it's only a matter of federalism. Akhil Amar has made this argument, Clarence Thomas has made this argument, and so it is by definition unincorporable. So maybe all these other provisions of the Bill of Rights remain applied to the states, but the Establishment Clause should not be applied to the states. Justice Thomas seems to be the only justice that's open to that argument, and so I think we're stuck with the Establishment Clause laws applying to the states for the foreseeable future. And so I think what we need to insist upon is that justices get that, the Establishment Clause right. And so it was applied to almost any case you can think of, including St. Isidore. I think there's no way, shape, or form that the Establishment Clause should be read to prohibit Oklahoma from creating a religious charter school on the same terms that it's created other charter schools. And in fact, it's a violation of the Free Exercise Clause to say we're going to create all sorts of charter schools, but not a religious charter school. So I think there's a way around the incorporation doctrine, not that we're trying to get around anything, but just even with the incorporation doctrine, the Establishment Clause shouldn't prohibit a number of these things that you probably have in mind.
Can you not make the argument that they're actually discriminating against the religious school?
Absolutely, and there's this wonderful trinity of cases where the U.S. Supreme Court has said time and time again, look, states, you cannot discriminate on the basis of religion. Look, Maine, you cannot say that you'll pay to send kids to high schools of all sorts except for religious high schools. You can't do that, and that's why really the Oklahoma charter school should have been permitted to exist. And I think when we get the next case and Amy Coney Barrett doesn't have to recuse herself, we'll have at least a 5-4 vote, maybe a 6-3 vote upholding religious charter schools. Clearly constitutional, no question.
Thank you.
Kelly, and we are just waiting for the Attorney General, who is on her way, should be here very shortly. Kelly?
I know we're, after lunch, we're going to have people talk about cases and bad cases, where we are now and all this, but so you wouldn't have the opportunity. So I want to ask you now, how do you've talked about the Establishment Clause, what cases or what areas do you think need to be changed or are wrong, and that where the court's off, at least until they change something? And then secondly, I wondered if, our duty is to provide recommendations to the president. I don't know if you have any in mind, but if the president said, hey, I would like you to come to my office and give me a recommendation on how we can advance and secure religious liberty into the future. If you have an idea, I'd love it. If not, maybe you can send it to us later, but I just want to post that.
Sure, I'll just highlight two things. There's a number of things that we might be thinking of. So just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the 100th anniversary to the day of Pierce versus Society of Sisters. You have a wonderful trilogy of cases from the 1920s where the U.S. Supreme Court, at a time where the U.S. Supreme Court is not known for protecting individual rights, made it crystal clear that parents have a fundamental right, a constitutional right, unenumerated but judicially enforceable, to control the moral upbringing of their children, to control the education of their children. So in Pierce, the great state of Oregon, my home state more or less, decided it was going to ban all private schools. And lo and behold, almost every private school is a Roman Catholic school. And the U.S. Supreme Court came back and said, no, you can't do that. Roman Catholic parents in Oregon have a right to send their kids to Roman Catholic schools if they want to. And the court has stuck with that and respected that right. But if you think about it, that's a very limited right. It's a right that's useful for upper middle class parents, for rich parents, but a lot of parents can barely afford to pay rent and buy food. They cannot afford to send their kids to pay their taxes and send their kids also to schools that reflect their worldview, Islamic schools, Jewish schools, Montessori schools, whatever that worldview might be. So I think robust school choice is a way to address one of the key problems with respect to religious liberty, and that would also get us out of some of these problems we're seeing coming out of Montgomery County, right? Where the county is insisting on teaching pornography to 3, 4, 5-year-olds, and parents are saying, no, let us at least opt out, and Montgomery County says, no, you can't opt out. You can opt out of all sorts of other things, but not this. Yeah, so to really empower parents to raise their children according to their religious convictions, really robust school choice is at least one thing, but also protecting parental rights to opt their children out to the extent to which we're stuck with public schools for the foreseeable future. At least parents should be able to opt their children out of education that they find morally or religiously objectionable. So I think those are both kind of tied together. Let me just say briefly, I'm not trying to be critical of anyone, but if you look at the Montgomery County case, that is only being litigated as a religious liberty case. I don't have any idea why it's not also being litigated as a parental rights case. Now, I'm not an attorney, and so there might be all sorts of great reasons for this, but I think this is something we need to resurrect in our current discourse.
Dr. Hall, thank you. In fact, they were so difficult in Montgomery County that they forbid a young lady from graduating which impacted her ability to go to college. And she was a top-tier student, because she said she would attend these classes, but she would not stand by what they were teaching because it was against her religious beliefs, and they've stopped her from graduating. Thank you for your testimony. Please give Dr. Hall your applause. And now we can switch the stage for the Attorney General. We want to switch the stage. While they're moving the chair, if you'll just follow, if you want to stand up really quick, like for 30 seconds and sit back down, because the Attorney General will be here. So don't go anywhere, but stretch your legs for 30 seconds while we move.